Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Amanda Lang. Coming up in the show, federal outsourcing continues to hit new highs. So are we getting value for money? And Canada's Competition Act is getting a refresh, but is it enough? Our exclusive interview with the Commissioner of Competition is ahead. Plus, Canadians are tired of tip inflation. Maybe it's time to retire tipping altogether. That's all ahead. First, for the week that was in business, it's time for the briefs. Inflation in Canada cooled slightly in January to a rate of 5.9%. But prices for key items are still climbing at uncomfortable rates. It's the first time in almost a year that the headline inflation number has been below 6%, but food prices are still climbing more than 11%, and mortgages are almost 22% higher than they were a year ago. The question is whether the data is cool enough to satisfy the central bank or whether rates will rise again in the months ahead. Canada's largest grocer posted a big jump in sales and profit in its most recent report. Loblaw said sales rose 10% in the 3 months ending in December, while profit climbed to $529 million. It's benefiting from sales of drugs and beauty products, as well as a shift by consumers to store-label brands. Loblaw also said it expects profit this year to grow by double digits, which is more than analysts expected. Home Depot plans to spend $1 billion raising wages for its employees across the U.S. and Canada, with every hourly employee getting some kind of a raise. The floor on wages in all markets will be $15 an hour. Like many other retailers, Home Depot is facing the threat of unionization of its labor force. Both Walmart and Target announced pay raises in recent months. New research showed that while Canada is attracting immigrants in droves, now making up 90% of our population growth, we're doing poorly at employing them adequately. In fact, many immigrants are employed in jobs they are overqualified for. The study by RBC suggests that accepting foreign credentials is a big part of the problem. It also found that new Canadians are more likely to be vulnerably housed and spend more of their income on housing. The world's biggest pilot of a 4-day work week is wrapping up with a clear bias in favor of the shorter span. The UK study involved 61 companies of varying size with a total of 2,900 employees. The week was dropped to 32 hours with no change in pay or output. The majority of participants will continue the shorter work week, citing overall worker health and productivity improvements. Facebook's parent company, Meta, has won a temporary victory against a class action lawsuit in the UK, claiming it should compensate users for the value of their personal data. A judge there put a hold on the $3.7 billion suit, but gave the plaintiff's lawyers 6 months to shore up the arguments against the platform. The heart of the argument is Facebook used its dominant position in the market to monetize user data without compensation. The federal government is on track to outsource a record $21.4 billion in contracts this year, according to the Parliamentary budget officer. Yves Giroux also noted that while the amount of service provided by outsiders has risen, so too has the number of government employees. Total spending on professional and special services has risen from $8.4 billion in 2016. And those are your business briefs. Well, as outsourcing contracts grow in size, so does the federal payroll. The Parliamentary Budget Office is asking a reasonable question. Are we getting good bang for our buck? Yves Giroux is Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So there has been a lot of focus on these consulting contracts, special services. So I'm going to start there. It is a number that continues to grow. It is at a record level this year. It will be for this year. What do we make of that? And I guess what I mean by that is, Yves, there's nothing necessarily wrong with outsourcing. We might be getting amazing value for that money. How do we know what we're getting?
Well, it's difficult to know what we're getting. What we know is the amount the government is spending on these external services, which vary in their nature. They can range from healthcare services for First Nations to veterans to consulting services for IT or the provision of advice to the government for various types of operations. But do we know exactly what we're getting? I don't personally have a good sense of that, and I'm not sure that Canadians in general have a good sense of that. It's up to the government to determine whether it has. It's getting good value for the money it spends on these professional outside services.
Do we have any evidence that the government has a good sense of that, or is there a way to track return for the investment?
Well, it's very difficult when you get into the type of contracts that lead to advice or confirming what the government is already doing. There are things that are inherently difficult to measure. For example, audit services. I think it would be feasible to measure the outcomes and the results we're getting. For example, if we were talking about healthcare services for veterans or for First Nations, but I don't know if these reports do exist. I'm sure they exist somewhere, but they're probably disseminated across the public service.
We are tracking, and this is a document that your office prepares that's quite useful as we head towards the spring budget, of course, tracking to $443 billion in spending by this government, up almost $30 billion from last year. Characterize for me how would you characterize that level of spending? Is that a big spending government versus our history?
Well, if you compare to the pandemic, it's much lower than what we saw during the pandemic. But compared to pre-pandemic, it is still significantly higher than what we saw prior to the pandemic. Mind you, the economy has grown since, the population has grown, but it still represents a slightly higher proportion of the economy than it used to. So it is a government that is not shy about spending to intervene in areas that it sees as priority areas. So it is more spending than we used to see prior to the pandemic, and with that, slightly higher deficits as well.
One of the big areas that you highlight that is an increase that on this one-year anniversary will probably not get a lot of criticism is spending on defense and related to support of Ukraine. Just in terms of kind of that number, we're still way below what some would say we should be, but we are at historic multi-decade levels here on defense spending.
Yes, that's true. So it will be about $28 billion of spending on national defense this current fiscal year, which is high, but still falls short of the NATO commitment that NATO countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense issues. And to achieve that, we need to spend significantly more, some $13 billion more, just to meet that 2%. And with inflation, the amounts that we spend as a country on defense issues shrinks in real terms because inflation is eroding the real value of this spending.
Yves, it's so good to have you with us. Appreciate your time today.
It was a pleasure.
Yves Giroux is Parliamentary Budget Officer of Canada. Still ahead, from banking to grocers, there's a lot of concentration in Canada, but is there healthy competition? We are one-on-one with Canada's Commissioner of Competition next.